Manual task versus auto-scheduled task. There is a difference, and let me show you.
Auto-scheduled tasks mean that project takes over and does all the work for you, as long as you have built up a network logic in your schedule. Manual scheduled tasks mean that you do all the work. You have to manually input the dates, and anytime something changes, all the logic is ignored, and you still have to make all the changes to all the tasks that are manually scheduled. How do you find out if your task is manually scheduled or auto-scheduled? You would look at the task mode field. Insert that column to look. If you have a auto-scheduled task, it's going to show a bar with an arrow. If you have a manual scheduled task, it's going to show a blue thumbtack. Notice how, too, when I changed it to a manual task, the Gantt side also changed. It'll show you a teal bar for any manual scheduled task. Project has it where manual tasks are the default, but you can change it. Go down to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and you'll see that new task currently right now says auto-scheduled. If you wanted to change that for this project, you could just click on it and change it manually here. You could change it to manually versus auto. If you wanted to change it for all future projects that you're working on, you would go up to File, Options, and then under the Schedule tab, you would see where it says New Task Created or Auto-Scheduled. If this was not, if it was manually, you would change it to auto. My preference is to encourage that all tasks are auto-scheduled because you want project to do the work for you. You don't want to make your workload harder than it has to be. Just make sure that for all future tasks, you would select all new projects and then make sure that the new task created is auto-scheduled. Then say, okay. When you have the option as new tasks are manually scheduled, it's a pretty cool feature because you can add a new task and there will be no duration and no dates assigned to it. Some people like it for this reason alone, but my recommendation is still, if you just don't want to see dates for a task or assigned dates, just white it out. I use this method for summary tasks because sometimes that confuses people, and I will make that white instead of making it a manually scheduled task. So why don't we want manually scheduled tasks? So if I were to say that I'm going to change this back to a auto-scheduled task. If I were to say, okay, we did not get this short project started on July 31st and it delayed, I'm going to change that date here by the project information. I'm going to change it to December 4th. When I do this and the tasks are all auto-scheduled, you can see that now everything changed to start December 4th. That's what we want. Now let's see what it does when it's manually scheduled. If I change this first task to be manually scheduled again, and then I go up to project information and change it to be December 4th, just like I did in the last scenario, it's going to say, can't do it. And then there you go. You just can't do it. When you want to change a task, you've got to look manually scheduled task. If you double click on them, the constraint type is locked. You cannot change that. So in order for that to happen, you would have to change this to be auto-scheduled again, and then you would go in and change it to be as soon as possible to then change the project date for it to pull in. Say the duration of a manually scheduled task changes. So if this pulls in to be just 15 days, you can see everything does respect it. If this were to move out to 25 days, you can see that everything does respect it. That's because everything else is auto-scheduled. Now, manually scheduled task every once in a while is okay for this reason. You can see. You just have to remember that you are the one in control of that task, not project, so you have to change it. Let's say a couple other things are also manually scheduled. So if I change both of these to be manually scheduled, you can see on the right side that they change graphically so that you can visually see easily which ones are manually scheduled. So say now that I change the duration of these to, say, 30 days. Look at what happened. The auto-scheduled task did move out and respected the link, but the manually scheduled task didn't. You can see that graphically it changed. The outline of it became dashed to show that it's not honoring its logic. You can also see in the finish date that finish date is squiggled in red. This also means that it's not respecting the logic. It's a manually scheduled task. So you could go in and update it manually if you wanted to. If I were to manually change the date, I can do that. It's respecting now the link, but it's not respecting this link. You have to then remember what all the logic was, where it's not just dependent on draft 1 SDD, it was also dependent on the review. So I have to then respect that review to say, okay, it really can't start until 9/22. Now it's right. You can see that. But it's a ripple effect. So I updated draft 1, I updated draft 2, but now you can see that the final draft is dotted. It's not respecting. So I have to then go and fix that to say, okay, it's also dependent on review 2, so that's November 1st. So it can't start until after November 1st, so November 2nd. There. Now everything is back to not being dashed lines and everything's respectful. But look at how hard that was. I had to update 3 of those manual tasks on my own, where if they were all auto-scheduled, Project would do it for me. I've changed those tasks back to being auto-scheduled, and if I were to increase the duration of task 1 and then show it, this is where auto-scheduled task, Project figures out all the information for you and calculates how it affects every other task, as long as your network logic is complete. Sometimes people will put a summary task as a manual task, and I get this because, like I said, when we add a new task and if it's manually scheduled, it doesn't have any dates, and sometimes summary dates can confuse a lot of people. This is where I will just white them out so that way it doesn't confuse people, because summary task you cannot change. Summary task take on the earliest start from the task nestled underneath it and the latest finish from the task nestled underneath it. You want it to auto-calculate, but say you have it as a manually scheduled task. This you can see right here. On the Gantt side, it'll show you what it currently is. The top line is your summary task, and then it's showing that it is manually scheduled. If I were to change any kind of duration under this for a child task underneath it, if I said the review took 12 days, you can see on the Gantt side, that bar turned red, meaning that if it were auto-scheduled, this is what Project is calculating it at, but because I have it manually scheduled, it did not change. On the left-hand side, you can see that it kept the date that I manually set as November 17th, but it's saying that Project's calculating that that's not when it's going to be. So you have an error there. So anytime you see a squiggle line underneath a date, it means that task is manually scheduled and also not respecting the links. So that is not an auto-calculated date, and it's saying it's wrong. If I were to pull it in to say that it was now 8 days, you would then be able to see what it is, and the bar is showing what it should be. So I'm over-calculating, say everything will be done November 17th, but that's wrong. It's not. It's actually sooner. So that's where graphically you can see what it is. The blue will be if it's finishing sooner. The red is if it's finishing later than what your manual task is. So you don't want those summary tasks to be manual because it's not auto-calculating. You want it to be auto and to generate and have Project do the work for you. Otherwise, your tasks don't reschedule if they're manual. You get undesirable logic issues if it's manual, and it ignores dependencies. And you are in charge of every task that is manual. Take the workload off and make everything be auto-scheduled so that Project can calculate for you.
Hope this helps you for today. Now go out there and flowcast those projects.